reminding us that his life after November 8th, 2016. The topic today, as you all know, is development fees, and we're privileged to have Chris Muschuk, who's a senior planner with the City of Boulder and is in charge of the city's current development fee study, and Steve Pomerantz, who's been very, very attentive to this issue for many years, talk about what is and isn't happening in Boulder with respect to development fees. Those of you who remember back a year ago or so remember that when ballot issue 301 was being proposed, the more sophisticated opponents of that measure said, "Oh yeah, of course we need fair development fees, but we need the council to do it, not this provision enshrined in the city charter. That would be terrible." And meanwhile, the council, from what I can tell, doesn't seem to be doing too much, and we haven't seen those people urging the council to take action. But maybe a little light will be shed on that situation today. As many of you know, there had been, the effort Chris is spearheading had been going on quite a while, since spring or so of 2015, and was sort of for a while in parallel with the ballot initiative 301 effort. And Chris's study is still continuing, and we're going to hear about that first off, and then Steve's going to give us some of his very considered comments. So Steve is that. So Chris, go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Alan, and good afternoon, folks. I'm going to, I think, maybe slide right back here a little bit just so I'm not standing in front of the screen, and Dick's going to click for me here. So if you want to click to the next slide for me. What I'm going to do is give an overview of the project that the city has been working on to update our development-related impact fees and excise taxes. And then we have a public hearing that the council will be holding next Tuesday on November 15th, where they'll be making some decisions on changes to the fees. So this is good and timely. So this project has had several phases to it. And the project began actually back in January of 2015 when the city council at their retreat identified updating our fees and taxes as a high priority work plan item. And then it was in May the council weighed in on the scope of that project. We hired consultants in the summer of 2015 and then began the actual update project. And then we did some background research, kind of gathered all of the background materials, held a study session with the council back in October of 2015, and then formed a technical working group to assist in reviewing the technical materials of the project. We've got some of those working group members here today, which is great. So the council then reviewed draft materials in April of 2016, and then we held another study session with council in June and in August, and then a discussion item with council in September of this year, and that brings us really to today. And then on November 15th will be the public hearing on this item, and then we'll move into more of an implementation phase. So Dick, if you want to click forward for me, I think there'll be a couple of animations here we can click past. If you keep going for me. And one more. Perfect. So we've done several different ways of trying to get some outreach on this project. It can get very technical very quick. If you are interested in sitting down and reading the couple hundred pages of technical analysis, I invite you to do so. The final packet actually just went out yesterday for that. But I'm going to try and boil it down to a little more simple terms. I will wholeheartedly admit my head has been in this long enough now that at times I may start speaking in what sounds like technical language. If I'm not making sense, call me on it and ask me to explain, because sometimes I'm doing it unconsciously. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The objectives for this project that we reviewed with council and that council reviewed again back in September actually was to continue achievement of our Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, that growth shall pay its own way. And then the second piece is to make sure we complete the legally required studies to be able to support updating our current capital facility impact fees that we have, to create or update our transportation excise tax into more of a multimodal transportation, maybe an impact fee or excise tax. What we've landed on is both of those. And then lastly, to update the affordable housing commercial linkage fee. So this is a fee charged on non-residential development to support affordable housing. Next slide. So just real quick, what are impact fees and excise taxes? They're one-time charges on new development to support one-time improvements for capital facilities, so infrastructure. The only twist on that is related to that affordable housing linkage fee. That money actually goes to support the construction of affordable housing or creation of affordable housing. But it's charged on new development at the time of a building permit to be able to support that expansion of infrastructure. So the way that works is new development occurs in the community, and that brings new people to our community in terms of residents and workers. Those new residents and workers create a small incremental demand, additional demand on our infrastructure. And so we do these studies to establish what's growth's share of that additional increment that we're going to need to construct to meet that new demand. So an example of that would be as new folks move to the community, one of the things that these fees pay for is the collection materials at the library. So we know right now basically how many collection materials, books and other items per person for the people that live in the community today. As new folks move here, there'll be an additional demand on the collection materials at the library. So we charge a small incremental fee to be able to provide that additional collection material to maintain that same level of materials per person. So that's the basics of how this works. So you have to do studies to be able to establish that for the foundation of these fees and taxes. So that's where we get to where we are today. Next slide. So what we have today are 6 impact fees that are these categories right here. So that pays for, in the fire department, it's the fire stations and the fire trucks themselves. For municipal facilities, that's all of our municipal office space. In human services, that's our senior centers and the Children, Youth, and Families Center on Spruce Street. For Parks and Recreation, that includes all of our Parks and our recreation centers, the Parks and Recreation administrative buildings, as well as then all of the maintenance facility as well. The library impact fee goes to paying for the library buildings of our 4 branch libraries, as well as the collection of materials. The police impact fee goes towards our public safety building, supporting the public safety building. The affordable housing linkage fee I will talk about in just a little bit. We have 2 excise taxes in the community right now. We treat those the same way as we do our impact fees, essentially, except for there's a little bit of a difference in that they are actually taxes, not fees. So taxes in that they're a taxing authority. They have a little bit different legal requirements. I can dive into that more if you'd like, but right now we have our development excise tax supports parkland. So that would be actually land to buy additional parks, and then transportation. Next slide. So the proposed changes are to update all of these, is the basics. And so I'm going to go through each of those. What we've done is we've kind of been carrying along 3 different tracks of changes. First, all of our impact fees. Second, transportation. And third, the affordable housing linkage fee. Those are almost like 3 mini projects inside this one big project. We've been carrying them all along together. We're now, the decision making on those is in a slightly separated order. So that's the way I'm going to present it a little bit. So next slide. The first is the proposed changes to our capital facility impact fees and the changes for transportation funding. And so on Tuesday night on the 15th, council will be considering an ordinance to approve these changes. We as a staff have recommended that these changes become effective on July 1st of next year. And for residential development, the increase in fees basically boils down, we apply it to a hypothetical residential development project of an increase in $1.05 per square foot. And so right now, when we look at these fees applied to a hypothetical residential development project, which in our case is a 3-unit townhome building, and we look at it, one of the metrics is to look at it in terms of total development cost. So how much are these fees in the construct of a total development project? Right now, today, they're about 1.9% of the cost of a project. That would go up to 2.3% of a project. That's another metric to look at it, as well as the kind of dollar per square foot. Next slide. Yes?
Chris, you've identified the proposed changes. What did the studies establish as justifiable?
The studies, there are 2 studies that justify these proposed fees, actually 3. The first is a capital facility impact fee study. So in our council materials, if you go to look at those, that'll be the first one, is for capital facility impact fees. Then the second one is we're proposing to create a transportation impact fee in addition to our current transportation excise tax. So there's a study for each of those. There's the transportation impact fee study, and then there's the transportation excise tax, development excise tax study. So there's 3 studies that we're prepared to support the changes.
And so my question is, as you go through each of these, you identify what the proposed changes, either in percent or dollar amount. Can you equate that to what the study said was justified? So
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yep. So for the capital facility impact fees, what we're recommending is exactly what the study came out with in terms of supportable fees. And for transportation, with the impact fee and excise tax, you have to make sure you don't double count in there. You aren't counting the same things and taxing for it as well as charging a fee for it. So the way we've divided those 2 studies is related to improvements by mode of transportation. So the impact fee will pay for street improvements, or what we call streets improvements, and then the excise tax will pay for bus, bike, and walk improvements, is the way we kind of divided it. Those 2 studies, the way that the analysis has been done, what we're recommending to the council is what those studies have established. Next slide. On the non-residential side, same analysis applied to a non-residential development project, hypothetical development project, results in about a 97 cent per square foot change. So for both of those, not massive changes, but it's real dollars in terms of development. And so in terms of the context of that, this hypothetical non-residential development project is about a 61,000 square foot office building, is the prototype we applied it to. Our current fees for impact fees and transportation is about 1.2% of development cost. It would go up to 1.5% of development cost. Make sense so far?
Yeah. Not at all.
Say that again.
Not at all. It's ridiculously low. Go ahead.
And same question, so you're recommending roughly what these studies?
We're recommending what the studies come out with. The only place we are not recommending exactly the number that the study comes out with is related to the commercial linkage fee for affordable housing, and I'll get into that here in just a little bit.
So this is some sense a step backwards from these questions, I think, but usually people do these studies and they come out with the true cost of all of these things that you're talking about. And then the political bodies don't have the guts to pass on the full cost. So are you saying that what numbers you're showing for what the study recommends are the full cost? What, and how does what you're recommending compare with the full cost?
So to be totally honest, it depends on how you define total cost or full cost.
Sure.
It is our analysis in that the proposed capital improvements that are necessary to support the additional growth that will occur in the community are included in these studies, and that's what we're recommending, is to take that full number. It's the same thing the council did in 2009, was they adopted the numbers that came out of the study.
Okay,
So
so let me just say this back, if I may.
Sure.
So the studies calculate by some mechanism the full cost, and that's what you're recommending,
that's what we're recommending.
without defining at this point, which we don't probably need to go into, what the technical full cost is.
Yeah, we could dive into that some more if you'd like, but
So
yeah.
should we, I have a feeling that we've got to talk about some of these things, and I wonder if it would make more sense to hold these questions.
Mine was the point you're talking about, which essentially is, it only makes sense to charge those fees if you've included all the costs. And I'll give you a typical example, because I was on that technical committee in 2008, is we used to charge for a buy-in fee for parkland. Some reason we're not charging for that anymore, and there's no legal reason why we're not doing it. So the only solution I can come up with is, there's been political pressure on the folks who did the study not to do that, or there's been political pressure somewhere because we used to do it, it makes total sense, but now we're not doing it. So to your point, if you're not doing the study right, then the conclusions you come out with aren't right either.
Well, I think it might be more orderly if we let Chris and Steve talk, and then we have these kinds of comments and questions when they finish, so they can both react. So go ahead, Chris.
That sounds good. Specifically to parkland, we are recommending that we eliminate the parkland excise tax. And the reason for that is because the city, the Parks and Recreation Master Plan does not identify a need to purchase any parkland in the next 20 years. So why should we collect a fee for something that we don't intend to spend any money on? That's the rationale of why we're recommending to suspend that parkland excise tax at this time, and you'd be able to use that taxing authority in transportation. So let's go to the next slide. So now I'm going to switch gears to the affordable housing linkage fee. So this one is a little bit different than the others in that this is a fee charged on non-residential development to be able to support the creation of affordable housing. So this is essentially on the residential side, we have our inclusionary housing program. This would be essentially the fee to support affordable housing on the non-residential side. So the scope of this, if you click the next slide for me, is to update the 2009 study that we did to create the commercial linkage fee. So in 2009, we had a study that was done to be able to establish a fee to charge on non-residential development. At that time, as many will recall, the economy was not maybe in such a great place. So the council at that time only was charging this fee on the density bonus in the DT5 or downtown zoning district. Last year, the council expanded that fee citywide, but when we did that, we acknowledged that the study is now dated and it's time to make sure we update it. So this time, when we are updating the study, we did it with a slightly different approach of what's called a jobs housing nexus analysis, which sounds really fancy, but I'm going to explain what that is. So if you go to the next slide. The philosophy behind that is as new non-residential development occurs in the community, that new non-residential development will bring new employees that work in the community. A portion of those new employees will create an additional demand for affordable housing. And that varies based on the type of development, office versus hotel versus industrial or warehousing. But so in those different categories, there is an additional demand created for affordable housing. And so then you do the study to establish what's the maximum legally supportable fee that you can charge, and then you have to establish what that fee is. So if you go to the next slide. What that study has come out with is that the maximum supportable fee is $57 a square foot for office, which is a really, really, really big number. And most communities across the country, you don't set the fee at that maximum supportable number. You have to set it at something lower.
Can you repeat that, please?
The dollar amount, $57 per square foot for office. The rates vary a little bit depending on the use. And so what communities have to do is figure out how are you going to establish what your fee level is. And so we brought 4 different options to the council. was to base it either on our 10% goal for affordable housing, for low and moderate income. Do we establish it based on a middle income housing goal? Do we try and match the income profile in the community? Or do we base it on market and economic factors? If you go to the next slide. What the council selected was to focus it on market and economic factors. So what are the market and economic factors? If you go to the next slide. Those are things like market strength, development feasibility, scaling the fees relative to other development costs, kind of like I talked about before, also looking at fees in other communities. And so when the council said bring us back market and economic factors, they also said, and apply 3 potential fee levels, $10 a square foot, $20 a square foot, and $35 a square foot. To set that in context, our current fee is $9.53 per square foot. So if you go to the next slide, our consultant for this project has looked at what are the development costs in terms of impact fees, or I should say the commercial linkage fee in relation to development costs. And most high, kind of really strong commercial market communities like Boulder that have these commercial linkage fees are usually up to about 5% of development cost in the community. The third option that was established, the $35 per square foot, what the consultant said is it would exceed all other linkage fee programs in the United States. Next slide. To look at that in terms of maybe the market strength, it's kind of hard to see some of the text on here, but across the bottom here, this is office rents per square foot for a community. And on this side is the linkage fee per square foot for office development. So you can see here's Boulder today at $9.53 a square foot, and we're in that kind of about $35 per square foot range for office rents. So you can see there's a bit of a band here. So you have communities like Mountain View or Palo Alto that have incredibly high office rents per square foot, but they also have a pretty high fee. So we've mapped out the different options of $10 a square foot, $20 a square foot, and $35 a square foot, just to see where that plots in terms of market strength. What we're recommending to the council on Tuesday night is to establish or revise the fee, I should say, to $15 a square foot for office, which is this spot right here. Next slide. I don't expect you to see this slide or read this. This is in our council materials, but what it does is it looks at what would the fees be for different uses from office at 15, hotel, retail, and then flex commercial compared to our current fees. And then there's 2 sections down here is what's these fees as a percent of development cost. It's right at about 5% for office, and then it's around 4% or 5% for all of the others as well. So in terms of comparing ourselves to other communities on that high end. The last one is just what's this total development cost for both the linkage fee as well as all of our other development costs to give you kind of a percentage. So today, what our staff recommendation is, the current fees, total development cost for office is about 6% of development cost. With all of these proposed changes, it would go up to about 8%. Next slide. So to look at that, like I did with the others, it's kind of $1 per square foot applied to our hypothetical development project. Again, that's about a 61,000 square foot office building, but it's got a little bit of retail and a little bit of food service restaurant in it. So currently, that project would pay $9.38 per square foot for the affordable housing linkage fee. The proposed, because of those other uses, it's not exactly 15. So it's an increase of about $5.32 per square foot. So right now, our linkage fee is about 3.1% of development cost. Under the proposed staff recommendation of $15 a square foot, it goes up to 4.9%. Next slide. So to wrap these all together, what's the increase total for non-residential development? So that's the impact fees, transportation, as well as the affordable housing linkage fee. If you were to apply this to that same non-residential project, the fees in terms of dollar amount per square foot go up by about $6.30 per square foot. I can break down the actual real numbers of what that looks like But in terms of development cost, percent of development cost goes from about 4.3% to 6.4%. So I know that is a lot of numbers, a lot of data, very technical. So in terms of, as Alan described, I think I will conclude there and then pass it off to Steve, but then I'll be happy to answer questions after we're done. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
First off, I don't work for the city. They would not hire me for sure. Second, I guess I would say probably I'm about as expert on this subject as anybody who is not in the business doing consulting work, and I probably know more than a lot of the consultants, because for the last 30-odd years, this is the subject that I have focused on in my involvement in government. With regard to this particular process, just to go back a little bit of history, the first time Boulder did this was in 1996, did a real impact fee study other than for utilities, which are tap fees, which have been going on for a long time. And at that time, the city hired Tischler Buys, which was one of the firms that worked on this project and also worked Lasco. And that was actually a really good job that was done, and they answered some tough questions mainly because frankly I was on the council and they couldn't avoid it. So they actually did good work. The 2008 study was very flawed. I'm giving you examples of this so you understand how much hand waving goes on. One of the consultants' views was you can't charge for anything you don't have debt on. Now, just to give you, this is some background so you get the feeling for this stuff. The city owns $1.2 billion of water assets, water rights, reservoirs, treatment plants, and that stuff. There's almost no debt on it. If the city couldn't charge for impact fees for things it has no debt on, we wouldn't have any water tap fees. Then the citizens would never get paid back for all that investment, just to give you a feeling. And then the next one was, oh, it's not a utility, therefore you can't charge full impact fees. I mean, consultants come up with a lot of hand waving, and their fundamental job is to protect their own interest, which is we don't want to ever lose a lawsuit over the fees being too high. So their whole thing is to squash the fees down. This is based on many years of experience. So, okay, that's your background. By the way, I think Chris did a really good job on running this project, and I don't blame him personally for any of the flaws in this thing, of which there are plenty. No, actually, he's a good guy, so it's okay. Okay, onward here. Next, yeah. Okay, so the great American dream. Many cities operate like adding jobs and population is going to make them better places to live. But what actually happens when they succeed? Housing prices skyrocket, traffic becomes a nightmare, taxes go up, facilities become overcrowded. Why? Because they don't require new development to pay to mitigate its impacts. Next. So it's clear, raising taxes will not force growth to pay its own way. So I ran an example just to check. If taxes were raised enough to actually maintain level of service and growth was at 1% a year like Boulder, and then think about it, the facilities have to go in place when the growth occurs, but if you're paying with taxes, you pay over time for those, so you have to discount the future tax payments. It ends up, even after 50 years, new development would have paid about 20% of the costs it imposed on the community. You can do the math, the 80% is left for the rest of us to pay. So raising taxes never will force growth to pay its own way. Next. Impact fees. An argument against impact fees in all development exactions is, oh, it's going to raise prices. But wait a second, prices are set by the market, not by costs. If impact fees are raised, profits go down. And nonprofits still impose costs. They can't raise prices, but the costs are still there. They don't magically disappear. Costs are going to be paid by the citizens, either through increased taxes or lower level of service. If development doesn't pay, and it doesn't matter whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. Oh, and on that point, I should point out that the housing authority projects don't pay any property taxes, so they're not paying for their schools and for the schools that they need. And interestingly enough, there's some other nonprofits around, in particular the co-ops, that should be paying property taxes and aren't. That's a whole other discussion. Okay, next. Now I'm going to give you the big picture here. This is looking at Colorado, because we actually have good data on Colorado. 2008, CDOT is Colorado Department of Transportation. They did this really big study. It was the only time they've ever done this that I know about. They really looked at the full costs, and they looked for 35 years out in the future, and they said, what is it going to cost to maintain level of service, meaning congestion doesn't get any worse? You can travel from A to B in the same amount of time. The number was $2 billion a year, $20,000 for each new person above expected revenues. That's the hole that we were going into year by year. $2 billion, and that's state, regional, and local. This is like the full picture. This is everything. Then I follow this stuff, and their most recent one was 2015, and the deficit at just the state level alone is $1 billion a year. That's $10,000 per new person. Okay, next. So, schools. Boulder Valley School District study that I was involved in, I can't even remember when, I couldn't find the paper on it, but it was probably 10, 15 years ago. And I updated the numbers using construction price index. The cost of new schools necessary to prevent increasing classroom size updated $12,000 to $13,000 per new single-family house above expected revenues. The number's about half that for attached housing, so we either pay increased taxes or do without. And in Colorado, wonderfully, state law actually forbids impact fees for schools. We can thank the legislature for that. Okay, next. Now, going to Boulder, shrinking down to Boulder. The only plan Boulder has that actually would prevent traffic from getting worse is the 2014 Transportation Master Plan, Vision Plan. Now, that's probably more than we need, but it's the only plan that actually would even get the job done. That plan would cost $459 million more than expected revenues over the next 20 years. That would double the transportation department's budget. That's how far behind we are. It's probably, we're not quite that far behind, but close. That's about $20,000 per new resident or new non-resident employee. They did a study in 2013. It turns out that both residents and non-resident employees have about the same traffic impact. Okay, next. Sorry to beat you with all these numbers, but the point is, I want you to get the scale, the magnitude of this picture. Housing, okay, now, this is the most recent study. This is the one the city contracted with Kaiser Martin Associates, Marsden, right? Marsden Associates. By the way, an aside on that, we would never have got Kaiser Martin. These guys are really good. They're from California. I had to beat on the planning director to get them, bring somebody else into the game, because hiring Tischler buys, from my perspective, not worth the trouble. Anyway, so these are the real numbers. This is from their draft study before anybody got to put their hands on this thing and change the numbers. High-tech office development, $129 per square foot. Retail, $158 per square foot. The current, current fee is $9.53 per square foot, to give you some idea. I'll go into how the numbers got shifted around in a bit here. Okay, next. So, this is the policy situation. Either new development pays or existing citizens pay. We pay one way or the other. We either pay through higher taxes or degraded levels of service. There aren't any other options. Developers, this is an important point actually. Developers don't just sell houses or office space. They sell access to roads, schools, rec centers, parks, affordable housing, and all kinds of other public amenities that they haven't paid for. That's where the profit is in development. It isn't the office space or the house, it's what you get to do when you walk out the door. Or to get in the door, for that matter. No wonder it's the best game in town. Next. Okay, here's the Boulder Valley Comp Plan policy that we're supposed to be following. It's actually a very well-written policy. Unfortunately, we don't follow it. The points to notice are the charges should be adequate to reasonably maintain current levels of service. It doesn't say just for capital facilities. It says current levels of service. That means if what it takes is more buses so that you can get from A to B at the same speed, that's a cost of growth. We'll get into that more because it's actually very relevant to the transportation thing. Then it says growth will be expected to pay its own way the cost of providing not only facilities but services over there, including affordable housing and negative impacts on the transportation system. So it's well-written policy, it's just too bad we don't follow it. Next. Sorry, Dave. Sorry, I had to say, from my perspective, the thing is a joke, these policies, because we don't follow them. And I already commented about hiring Kaiser Marston. They're actually really competent, so I think their initial work was actually accurate. Those numbers I was telling you, $129 per square foot, $158 per square foot for housing linkage fees. Okay, next. Now, how does this process work? I thought it would be useful to actually lay out how the process is supposed to work. So, step number 1, choose how you measure level of service. Examples, like Chris said, square feet of equipped library space, time it takes to get from the south end of Boulder to the north end of Boulder on Broadway. That's a level of service measure. Affordable housing relative to the employees that need it. Then you determine your current levels of service. So once you've defined what you're measuring, then you determine what the numbers are now. So for example, it takes, I'm making this up because I can't remember the numbers, it takes 15 minutes and 45 seconds on the average at 7 a.m. to drive from the south end of Broadway to the north end of Broadway.
No way.
7, okay, how about 2 in the morning? You get my point. There's a number for each of these things, and the key to these measurements, determining what the numbers are, is this: how do you measure it? For example, if you measure travel times at 7 a.m., 12 noon, and 5 p.m., and you don't measure at 8, 9, 10, 11, and 1, 2, 3, 4, you've missed a whole bunch of data. So for example, 20 years ago, congestion was roughly the same at the peak hours, but now the peak hours have expanded to fill pretty much the rest of the time. So you have to measure, you choose the right things, then you do your measurements. Then you design a plan, this is a critical piece, to maintain those levels of service given the impacts of growth. If you don't have a plan to do it, this stuff is interesting, but like, so what? That's a critical piece. You have to have a plan to actually maintain these levels of service. Then this then becomes where the consultants come in, really. How do you allocate those costs among the demand units? In other words, square feet of office space, residential units like that. Because how are you going to allocate these things? The cost. And then you set the impact fees or other exactions or development charges or development requirements to recover these costs or accomplish the mitigation directly. So, for example, this is actually really an important thing which totally gets dropped out in the transportation stuff. Not only do you have to recover the capital charges, which nowadays are relatively small, but you have to recover or require the development to put in place the other facilities and services necessary, like van pools, like eco-passes, which are ongoing requirements that they have to meet. If you don't have that, your plan isn't going to work. Next. Okay, so I call them the general fund facilities because I couldn't remember, frankly, what you called it. So, but these are the general fund: libraries, parks, police, that kind of stuff. Basically, the work got done well. The missing piece was, as Al brought up, the land that has already been purchased by the city. So, let me use the water, it's a better example. As I said, the city owns $1.2 billion worth of water-related assets. We charge people a tap fee based on buying into that system. In other words, it's got, I'm making this up, I'm pretty close, 35,000 acre feet of water. You take 1.2 billion, you divide by 35,000 acre feet, you come up with a number. If a house requires a third of an acre foot, you take a third of that number, and that's what they pay. And that's actually how they do it pretty much. I think that's what, those are numbers about right. It comes out about $18,000, which is the current single-family tap fee. There's not a single dollar of that money that gets spent buying new facilities. It's all going to pay the citizens back for what they already bought. That's why it's called buy-in. Well, we didn't do that with the land. Why? Well, you heard what Chris said. I don't consider that to be a justification whatsoever. It doesn't make any difference to me if we bought the land yesterday or we buy it tomorrow, or we bought it 10 years ago or we bought it 10 years hence. It's a cost. If the citizens paid it, the development should pay it back. Next. So, transportation. Transportation to me was a big mistake the way they handled it. The fundamental problem was we don't have a plan, an implementable plan with real costs and real, here's the programs, here's the capital facilities to maintain levels of service. The way the current numbers were done was and I'm pretty sure I got this right, Chris can correct me, but the impact fee was based on the current CIP. The CIP is a capital improvements program, which was a number that was a 6-year set of expenditures, which is what the city thought they could afford. It has nothing necessarily to do with what's necessary. Now, maybe it's the right number, maybe it's the wrong number, but we don't know because we don't have the plan. Remember when I was giving you the steps? You have to have a plan. Without the plan, you can't do this work. And that, of course, means when the city council is looking at this thing, they're going, okay, well, that's the capital part. And since Sam is here, he made it. Well, what's the operating cost part? Are we going to require 50 years of eco-passes for every employee in the building? Are we going to require van pools for them to serve employees in surrounding buildings? Because you know some people are going to be driving, and they van pools could pick up the slack, reduce the traffic. What are you going to do? We don't have a plan. So it's all kind of, from my perspective, hand-waving. This plan should have been developed and tested before the consultants came on the job, frankly. They had plenty of time, because this thing started actually in November 2014, when the first RFQ, request for qualifications, was issued. And aside, I had to rewrite all of it. I actually did. Susan Richdom called me up and said, now let me ask you, is this okay now? Because I criticized it so much. And I spent like an hour and a half on the phone with her going through it. Anyway, next. Sorry. Sometimes I get a laugh out of this whole thing. Not usually, no. Okay, so $10 to $15 a linkage fee is like 1/10 of the real cost. Mike cracks about the developers and what the planning staff considers most important. This is the upper level, not Chris. I'm not blaming you for this. Next. So, another criticism which I have, which is, and they never, by the way, there was a working group, but the working group which I was on, and after we had given them all our input, then they come up with these schemes of this goal-based thing. They're talking about, okay, we're going to set the fees based on the goal of meeting the 10% affordable housing goal. Well, that's nice, except you don't base fees on goals. You base fees on maintaining level of service. And as soon as you shift to this, you completely undermine the legal underpinnings for impact fees. And you give the developers a legitimate complaint, and they're complaining. I mean, anyway, next. Okay. Now, then this was this actually I find not, this is unacceptable from my perspective. So I was looking through the material that's I don't know if it's gone to the council yet or it's going to the council, on the housing stuff. And here it says, the maximum impact fees for the 8 building types are as follows. This is the non-residential jobs housing linkage fee, and there's a bunch of numbers. These numbers were actually 45% of the real numbers. And what they did was, they took the real numbers and they said, well, what's the fraction of people that are living in Boulder, that work in these places, that live in Boulder? And we're only going to supply enough affordable housing for that fraction. So if you have 100 people who need affordable housing in a given office development, we're only going to think about providing affordable housing for 45% of them. And we'll set the fee on that basis. This is what this argument is. Next. I'm going, well, what about the other 55%? Oh, they're going to be in Lafayette or Weld County or wherever they're going to have to fend for themselves. And plus, of course, they get the traffic impacts. And then it continues. It says these totals represent the maximum impact fee that could be charged for new residential, non-residential construction. Not so. In the original study, the draft study, the numbers were not 45% of those numbers, but they were more than double. So, oh, by the way, and I discussed this maximum fee issue with the consultants ad nauseum and attorneys well before this study actually got the light of day, because I wanted to know if really we could charge the real numbers. And they said yes. So, here we are. My problem isn't, I know what the council would do with this, or the majority isn't going to charge anything like it, so it probably doesn't make any difference. But I just assume the real numbers be represented as the real numbers. Next. So here's an example. I thought this would actually make this whole thing a little clearer. People say all kinds of things about what it costs to build in Boulder. So my view was, I'm ignoring what people say about it. I'm going to look somewhere else for some real numbers. So you know, everybody knows what Pearl West is, right? 11th and Pearl, that giant box that is totally inappropriate in downtown. Okay. 175,000 square feet. Lou Della Cava, everybody knows who he is. He's one of Boulder's most famous developers. He really knows his stuff. He said it will likely sell for $550 to $800 a square foot. I figure he knows if anybody does. Okay, next. Now, because of all the growth in Boulder going on, Boulder's construction costs are inflated, because contractors can jack up prices because it's a seller's market in the construction business. So again, I used Denver as an example. So I found this building in Denver. This is high-end building, right downtown, 40 stories, $141 million, $213 per square foot. So the easy way to remember, it's a little over $200 a square foot. Next. Then I looked up in the construction cost index, $180 a square foot for 2 to 4-story office buildings in Denver. Okay, fine. So let's use the higher, inflate that, because that's 4 years ago. So you something over $200. Next. The numbers are actually, this is about numbers, so sorry, we got to do numbers. So, land costs, another big cost. That's public knowledge. It was $77 a square foot. And the permit fees per the city were around $2 million. So, you add all that up, you're roughly $300 a square foot. It doesn't matter, as you'll see, were you off by 10% or not. Next. So, $550 to $800 selling cost, $300. Subtract one from the other. Profits, $250 to $500 a square foot. Profit. So, and we're worrying about whether we're going to charge people $10 or $15 or $30 a square foot. Give me a break. Now, people say, well, other parts of the city, the numbers are lower. Yeah, but both sides, they're lower. Land costs are lower, and the prices are lower. Now, I didn't try to do examples for every part of the city, so I don't know. But my suspicion is that we could charge $80 a square foot, and it wouldn't hardly affect the profit levels. Now, but the real thing is, from my perspective, is this. Why should the existing citizens put up with growth if it isn't paying its own way? As I pointed out in the beginning, there are no net benefits to it. So why would we do it? And my view is it's a perfect self-regulating mechanism. If they aren't willing to pay for their impacts, fine, then it's not economically viable and they'll go somewhere else where it is, where they probably need the jobs and the development more. Next. So my conclusions, back to the beginning, either developers pay or we pay. It's a zero-sum game. There is no free lunch. That's point number one. Point number two, and longer Boulder waits to charge developers the full cost, the further behind we will get. And the city is doing its best to drag its feet, and it's moving as slow as it could possibly move. And requiring new development to pay its own way is the perfect self-regulating mechanism for growth. That's it. Thank you.